Imagine a world without schools as we know them, no toys from stores, no video games or smartphones. A world where children as young as 7 were already working full-time jobs, where half of all babies died before their first birthday, and where childhood as we understand it today simply didn't exist. This was the reality for medieval children living between the 5th and 15th centuries. Today, we'll take a journey back in time to explore what it was really like to grow up in the Middle Ages. We'll discover how these young people lived, worked, played, and survived in a world that was both harsh and fascinating. The medieval period, also known as the Middle Ages, lasted roughly from 500 to 1500 CE. During this time, Europe was a feudal society divided into rigid social classes. At the top were kings and nobles, in the middle were craftsmen and merchants, and at the bottom were peasants who made up about 90% of the population. Medieval childhood was vastly different from today. Children weren't seen as needing special protection or extended education, they were viewed as small adults who needed to learn practical skills for survival as quickly as possible. The concept of childhood as a distinct phase of life, with its own needs and protections, wouldn't emerge until much later in history. But despite these harsh realities, medieval children still found ways to play, learn, and experience joy. Their stories reveal the incredible resilience of young people throughout history. Life began dangerously for medieval children. The statistics are sobering: nearly half of all babies died before their first birthday, and only about 60% of children survived to age 10. Disease, poor sanitation, malnutrition, and lack of medical knowledge created a world where childhood mortality was tragically common. Medieval pregnancy was fraught with danger for both mother and child. Women had no understanding of prenatal care, and childbirth was attended by midwives who, while experienced, had no medical training. Many remedies were based on superstition rather than science. Birth typically took place in the family home, with female relatives and neighbors assisting. The birthing process was seen as a woman's domain, and men were usually excluded. Wealthy families might have better conditions and more skilled midwives, but even they faced significant risks. Those babies who survived birth faced immediate challenges. Swaddling was a common practice. Infants were wrapped tightly in cloth strips from head to toe, believed to help their limbs grow straight and prevent them from scratching themselves. This practice could last for months. Feeding presented another challenge. Wealthy families often hired wet nurses, women who had recently given birth and could breastfeed another's child. This was partly practical, as it allowed noble mothers to become pregnant again sooner, but it also carried risks as diseases could be transmitted through breast milk. Baptism was considered absolutely crucial and typically occurred within days of birth. The medieval church taught that unbaptized children who died could not enter heaven, making this ceremony urgently important to families. The high infant mortality rate meant that many parents lived in fear that their child might die before receiving this essential sacrament. Children were often named after saints, with the hope that their heavenly namesake would protect them. Biblical names were extremely common, and children might also be named after grandparents or other family members. Interestingly, families sometimes waited weeks or months before naming a child, wanting to see if the baby would survive before becoming too attached. Perhaps no factor was more important in determining a medieval child's life than the social class they were born into. The feudal system created vastly different experiences for children depending on whether they were born into nobility, the merchant class, or peasantry. Children born into nobility lived in a world of relative luxury, though even they faced challenges. Noble children resided in stone castles or large manor houses, with multiple rooms, fireplaces for warmth, and servants to attend to their needs. Their diet was varied and nutritious by medieval standards. They ate meat regularly, including beef, pork, venison, and fowl. They had access to white bread, fruits, vegetables, and imported spices. Meals were elaborate affairs with multiple courses, and children learned proper table manners and social etiquette from an early age. Boys from noble families received extensive education designed to prepare them for leadership roles. Around age 7, they might be sent to another noble household to serve as pages, learning basic skills like reading, writing, arithmetic, and Latin. They studied chivalric codes, learned to play musical instruments, and practiced courtly manners. At age 14, pages became squires, serving a knight directly. They learned to care for weapons and armor, practiced combat skills, and accompanied their knight to tournaments and battles. If successful, they might be knighted themselves around age 21. Noble girls received a different but equally important education. They learned household management, including supervising servants, managing finances, and organizing large households. They studied reading and writing, though not always to the same extent as boys. Accomplishments included embroidery, music, dancing, and sometimes languages. They learned about herbal medicine, as they would often be responsible for caring for sick family members and servants. Most importantly, they learned diplomacy and social skills, as marriages were political alliances and they needed to represent their families well. The growing merchant class in medieval towns created a middle ground between nobles and peasants. Merchant children lived in towns and cities, in houses that were comfortable but not luxurious. They had access to better food than peasants but not the variety available to nobles. Boys often learned their father's trade, whether it was selling cloth, working with metals, or trading goods. Some received basic education in reading, writing, and mathematics, essential skills for conducting business. Girls learned household management and sometimes helped with family businesses. About 90% of medieval children were born into peasant families, and their lives were defined by hard work, poverty, and constant struggle for survival. Peasant families lived in small cottages with 1 or 2 rooms, dirt floors, and few possessions. Their homes were dark, smoky, and often shared with animals during winter months. Windows were small openings with wooden shutters, glass was too expensive. Furniture was minimal, perhaps a table, some stools, and straw mattresses for sleeping. Peasant children survived on a monotonous diet of bread, porridge, vegetables, and occasional eggs or dairy products. Meat was rare and usually reserved for special occasions. Malnutrition was common, leading to stunted growth and increased susceptibility to disease. Bread was the staple food, but peasants ate coarse, dark bread made from rye, barley, or oats. White bread was a luxury reserved for the wealthy. Children often went hungry, especially during bad harvests or the months before new crops were ready. Medieval children didn't have the luxury of extended childhood. By age 7, they were expected to contribute significantly to family survival, and their daily lives were filled with responsibilities that would seem overwhelming to modern children. Medieval children woke at dawn, there was no concept of sleeping in. In peasant families, children immediately began morning chores, feeding animals, collecting eggs, milking cows or goats, and helping prepare the family's simple breakfast. Noble children had servants to help with basic needs, but they still followed structured routines. They attended morning prayers, ate breakfast in the Great Hall, and began their daily lessons or training. Children's work varied dramatically with the seasons. Spring brought planting season, where even small children helped scatter seeds and tend young plants. Summer meant long days in the fields, weeding crops, and caring for animals. Autumn was harvest time, the most critical period of the year. Children worked alongside adults from dawn to dusk, gathering crops that would determine whether the family survived the winter. Winter brought indoor work like spinning wool, weaving cloth, and helping with food preparation. Ages 3 to 5, very young children performed simple tasks like feeding chickens, collecting eggs, and helping with basic food preparation. Ages 6 to 8, children took on more complex responsibilities. They herded animals, helped with cooking, learned to spin wool, and began assisting with farming tasks. Ages 9 to 12, children were capable of most adult tasks. They plowed fields, harvested crops, cared for livestock, and learned specialized skills. Many began apprenticeships. Ages 13 plus, teenagers were considered nearly adult. They performed full adult workloads, married, and often left home to establish their own lives. For many children, especially in towns, apprenticeship offered a path to skilled work. Around age 12 to 14, children left home to live with master craftsmen, learning trades like blacksmithing, carpentry, weaving, or baking. Apprenticeships were formal contracts, often lasting 7 years. The master provided food, shelter, and training in exchange for the child's labor. Apprentices began with simple tasks and gradually learned more complex skills until they could work independently. The medieval approach to education was vastly different from modern systems. Most children received no formal education at all, learning practical skills through hands-on experience and oral tradition. Literacy was rare in medieval Europe. Historians estimate that only about 10% of the population could read, and far fewer could write. Most knowledge was passed down through oral tradition, practical demonstration, and apprenticeship. For the vast majority of children, education meant learning the skills necessary for survival: farming, crafts, household management, and basic religious knowledge. This education happened within the family and community, not in formal schools. The Catholic Church provided the only formal education system in medieval Europe. Monastery schools, cathedral schools, and later parish schools offered basic instruction to a small percentage of children. These schools primarily served boys from wealthy families, though some accepted promising poor children who showed potential for religious careers. The curriculum focused on Latin, basic arithmetic, religious studies, and sometimes music. Students learned to read using religious texts, particularly the Bible and prayer books. They wrote on wax tablets with styluses, as parchment was expensive and precious. Discipline was strict, with physical punishment common for misbehavior or slow learning. Monasteries were centers of learning in medieval Europe. Boys as young as 7 might be sent to monasteries to become oblates, children dedicated to religious life. These children received the best education available, learning Latin, theology, copying manuscripts, and sometimes Greek or Hebrew. Monastic schools preserved classical knowledge through the Dark Ages. Monks copied ancient texts, maintained libraries, and developed new forms of scholarship. Children in these schools had access to books and learning opportunities unavailable anywhere else. Girls' education was severely limited in medieval society. Most girls learned domestic skills from their mothers and other female relatives. They learned cooking, cleaning, textile production, child care, and basic medical knowledge. Noble girls might learn to read, though not always to write. They studied household management, social etiquette, and sometimes music or embroidery. Some learned basic Latin for religious purposes. Convents provided the only formal education opportunities for girls. Girls from wealthy families might be sent to convents to learn reading, writing, Latin, and religious studies. Some became nuns themselves, gaining access to scholarly pursuits denied to other women. The medieval approach to education was vastly different from modern systems. Most children received no formal education at all, learning practical skills through hands-on experience and oral tradition. For most medieval children, real education happened through practical experience. Children learned by doing, watching, and imitating adults in their daily activities. Agricultural knowledge was passed down through generations: when to plant and harvest, how to care for animals, how to preserve food, and how to read weather patterns. This knowledge was essential for survival. Craftsmen taught their skills through apprenticeships, passing down techniques that had been refined over generations. Children learned not just how to make things, but why certain methods worked and how to solve problems. In a largely illiterate society, oral tradition was crucial for preserving knowledge and culture. Children learned history, moral lessons, and practical wisdom through stories, songs, and proverbs. Professional storytellers, traveling minstrels, and local elders kept cultural traditions alive. Children learned about heroes, saints, moral behavior, and their community's history through these oral traditions. Religious instruction also relied heavily on oral tradition. Children learned prayers, biblical stories, and religious concepts through repetition and memorization, often without being able to read the texts themselves. By the 12th century, universities began appearing in medieval Europe. These institutions primarily served young men from wealthy families, typically starting their studies around age 14 to 16. University education focused on theology, law, medicine, and the liberal arts. Students lived in communal settings, often under strict discipline. While universities were important for the development of scholarship, they served only a tiny elite and had little impact on most children's lives. Despite their heavy workloads and adult responsibilities, medieval children did find time for play. Their games and toys were simpler than modern entertainment, but they served important functions in physical development, social learning, and preparation for adult life. Medieval children played with toys made from natural materials. Wooden dolls, carved animals, spinning tops, and balls made from animal bladders filled with air were common. Wealthier children might have more elaborate toys, but even these were handmade and simple by modern standards. Hoops were popular. Children would roll wooden or metal hoops with sticks, racing them through streets and fields. This game helped develop coordination and provided exercise. Stilts, made from wooden poles, were another favorite that improved balance and provided entertainment. Many games that medieval children played are still recognizable today. Hide and seek, tag, and various forms of ball games were popular. Blind man's bluff, where one child was blindfolded and tried to catch others, was common across all social classes. Knucklebones, played with actual animal bones, was an early form of jacks. Children would throw bones in the air and try to catch them on the backs of their hands. This game helped develop hand-eye coordination and dexterity. Winter brought opportunities for sledding, though sleds were simple wooden constructions. Children also played on frozen ponds and rivers, though this was dangerous and many accidents occurred. Spring and summer allowed for more outdoor activities. Children swam in rivers and ponds, climbed trees, and played in fields. They collected flowers, caught insects, and explored their natural environment. Many medieval games served educational purposes. Boys played with toy swords and practiced combat skills through mock battles. Girls played with dolls, learning nurturing skills and domestic roles through play. Board games like chess, drafts, checkers, and Nine Men's Morris were popular among the educated classes. These games developed strategic thinking and were considered appropriate entertainment for nobles. Religious festivals and community celebrations provided opportunities for organized play. Children participated in May Day celebrations, harvest festivals, and Christmas festivities. These community events often included games like apple bobbing, dancing, and competitive activities. Children learned social skills, community values, and cultural traditions through these shared experiences. Play served important social functions in medieval communities. It helped children learn social hierarchies, develop friendships, and practice cooperation. Games often reflected adult social structures, preparing children for their future roles. Mixed-age play was common, with older children teaching younger ones. This created informal education systems where knowledge and skills were passed down through generations of children. Medieval children's clothing reflected their social status, practical needs, and the limited resources available to their families. Fashion was not a concern for most children. Durability, warmth, and functionality were the priorities. Wealthy children wore miniature versions of adult clothing, made from expensive materials like silk, velvet, and fine wool. Boys wore tunics, hose, leg coverings, and pointed shoes. As they grew older, they might wear more elaborate garments with decorative elements. Noble girls wore long dresses or gowns, often with fitted bodices and flowing skirts. They wore head coverings from a young age, as uncovered hair was considered immodest. Their clothing featured rich colors achieved through expensive dyes, and garments might be decorated with embroidery or jewels. Wealthy children also wore accessories like belts, jewelry, and fine leather shoes. Their clothing was made by skilled tailors and seamstresses, and they often had multiple outfits for different occasions. Poor children wore simple, practical clothing made from coarse materials like rough wool, linen, or hemp. Boys typically wore simple tunics and basic leg coverings. Girls wore long dresses or skirts with simple tops. Peasant children often went barefoot, especially in summer. When they did wear shoes, they were simple leather constructions that provided basic protection. Many peasant children owned only one or two outfits, which they wore until they literally fell apart. Colors were limited to natural dyes available locally. Browns, grays, and muted earth tones were common. Bright colors were expensive and reserved for the wealthy. All medieval clothing was designed for practicality rather than comfort. Garments were often loose-fitting to allow for movement and growth. Children's clothing was frequently handed down from older siblings or altered from adult garments. Undergarments were minimal. Most children wore simple linen shifts under their outer clothes. Cleanliness was not a priority, and children often wore the same clothes for weeks or months without washing. Winter clothing was crucial for survival. Children wore multiple layers, including cloaks, thick tunics, and whatever warm garments their families could provide. Fur, when available, was used for warmth rather than fashion. Summer clothing was lighter but still covered most of the body. Modesty was important in medieval society, and children learned early to keep their bodies covered appropriately. Children's hair was typically kept simple and practical. Boys often had bowl cuts or similar simple styles. Girls wore their hair long but covered with caps or head coverings. Hygiene was limited by available resources. Most children bathed infrequently and used simple soap made from animal fat and ash. Dental care was minimal, and many children suffered from tooth decay and gum disease. Medieval medicine was primitive by modern standards, making childhood an extremely dangerous time. Children faced numerous health threats with little effective treatment available. Medieval children were vulnerable to diseases that are now preventable or easily treatable. Measles, smallpox, whooping cough, and various fevers claimed countless young lives. The bubonic plague, which swept through Europe multiple times, was particularly devastating to children. Malnutrition weakened children's immune systems, making them more susceptible to disease. Poor sanitation and limited understanding of hygiene contributed to the spread of illness through communities. Medieval families relied on folk remedies passed down through generations. Herbal medicines made from local plants were common treatments. While some herbs had genuine medicinal properties, many remedies were based on superstition rather than science. Common treatments included bloodletting, purging, and the use of various poultices and tonics. Parents might consult local wise women or herbalists, but trained physicians were rare and expensive. Medieval people believed that illness was often caused by sin or supernatural forces. Religious remedies included prayer, pilgrimage to holy sites, and the use of religious relics believed to have healing powers. Superstitious treatments were common. Amulets, charms, and magical rituals were used alongside or instead of practical medicine. Parents might consult local cunning folk or wise women who claimed supernatural healing abilities. Medieval understanding of hygiene was extremely limited. Children rarely bathed, and when they did, multiple family members often shared the same water. Soap was expensive and harsh, made from animal fat and ash. Dental care was minimal. Children cleaned their teeth with rough cloths or simple wooden implements. Many suffered from tooth decay, gum disease, and related infections. Medieval children faced numerous physical dangers. Farm accidents, falls, burns from open fires, and injuries from animals were common. Treatment options were limited and often ineffective. Broken bones were set without understanding of proper alignment. Infections were common and often fatal. Many children lived with permanent disabilities from untreated injuries. Medieval people had no understanding of mental health as we know it today. Children experiencing psychological trauma, developmental disabilities, or behavioral problems were often viewed as possessed, cursed, or simply difficult. Treatment for mental health issues was often religious or superstitious in nature. Some communities were more tolerant of differences, while others ostracized or mistreated children who didn't conform to normal expectations. Medieval children transitioned to adulthood much earlier than in modern societies. The concepts of adolescence and extended childhood development were unknown. Children were expected to take on adult responsibilities as soon as they were physically capable. The age of legal adulthood varied but was typically around 12 to 14 years old. At this age, children could legally marry, enter into contracts, and inherit property. This early transition reflected the practical realities of medieval life, where survival often depended on everyone contributing to family welfare. Boys from peasant families typically began full adult work around age 12 to 14. They might inherit family land, take over family trades, or leave home to work as laborers or soldiers. Noble boys followed a more structured path. After completing their service as pages and squires, they might be knighted around age 21. This ceremony marked their official entry into the warrior class and adult society. Apprentices completed their training and became journeymen, eventually hoping to establish their own workshops and become masters. This process could take many years and required significant skill and resources. Girls typically married very young, often between ages 12 to 16. Marriage immediately brought adult responsibilities, including household management, child-rearing, and supporting their husband's work. Noble girls' marriages were arranged for political and economic advantage. They might be betrothed as children and married as soon as they reached puberty. Their education focused on preparing them for these roles. Peasant girls also married young, though they might have slightly more say in choosing their partners. They immediately took on household responsibilities and typically began having children within a year or two of marriage. Religious milestones marked important transitions in medieval children's lives. Confirmation, typically around age 7 to 12, marked a child's full membership in the Christian community and their responsibility for their own spiritual welfare. First Communion was another important milestone, marking the child's participation in the central Christian ritual. These ceremonies emphasized the child's growing responsibility and integration into adult religious life. Coming of age brought legal rights and responsibilities. Young people could own property, make contracts, and be held fully accountable for their actions. They were expected to contribute to community defense and participate in local governance. However, this transition also meant losing the limited protections of childhood. Young people were fully subject to adult punishments for crimes and expected to support themselves economically. Medieval childhood was filled with dangers, hardships, and challenges that are difficult for modern people to imagine. Children faced constant threats to their survival and well-being. The statistics of medieval childhood mortality are sobering. Approximately 30 to 50% of children died before age 5, and only about 60% survived to age 10. These numbers varied by region, social class, and time period, but they illustrate the precarious nature of medieval childhood. Disease was the primary killer of children. Epidemic diseases like plague, measles, and smallpox swept through communities, claiming enormous numbers of young lives. Malnutrition weakened children's immune systems, making them more vulnerable to illness. Poverty was a constant reality for most medieval families. Poor harvests, economic downturns, and political instability could push families into desperate situations. Children suffered from malnutrition, inadequate shelter, and lack of basic necessities. During times of extreme hardship, families might be forced to sell children into servitude or abandon them to religious institutions. Some children became beggars or turned to crime to survive. Medieval Europe was frequently torn by wars, raids, and conflicts. Children were often caught in the crossfire of adult conflicts. They might be killed, injured, or displaced during battles and raids. Domestic violence was also common and largely accepted. Children had no legal protections from abusive parents or masters. Physical punishment was considered normal and necessary for discipline. Medieval children had virtually no legal rights. They were considered property of their parents or masters and had no recourse against mistreatment. Child labor was not just accepted but expected. Marriage at extremely young ages was common, particularly for girls. These marriages were often arranged for economic or political reasons, with little regard for the child's wishes or well-being. Medieval communities were vulnerable to natural disasters. Famines, floods, fires, and severe weather could devastate entire regions. Children were particularly vulnerable during these crises. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 killed millions of people across Europe, with children being among the first victims. Such disasters could destroy entire family lines and leave surviving children orphaned and destitute. The rigid social hierarchy of medieval society meant that most children had no hope of improving their circumstances. Peasant children would remain peasants, with little opportunity for education or advancement. Social mobility was extremely limited. A child's future was largely determined by their birth circumstances, and few opportunities existed to change one's social position. Despite the enormous challenges they faced, medieval children demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability. Their ability to survive and thrive in such difficult circumstances speaks to the fundamental strength of human nature. Medieval communities often provided support networks for children. Extended families, neighbors, and religious institutions sometimes stepped in to help orphaned or disadvantaged children. Godparents had real responsibilities for children's welfare. Craft guilds and trade associations provided some protection for apprentices and young workers. These organizations had rules governing treatment of young people and sometimes intervened in cases of abuse. Medieval children developed survival skills that modern children rarely need. They learned to find food in nature, treat minor injuries, and adapt to harsh conditions. These skills were essential for survival in an unpredictable world. Children also developed strong social networks and mutual support systems. They learned to rely on each other and work together to overcome challenges. Despite their hardships, medieval children contributed to the cultural life of their communities. They participated in festivals, learned traditional songs and stories, and helped preserve cultural traditions. Many medieval children grew up to become skilled craftsmen, farmers, scholars, and leaders. Their experiences, while difficult, prepared them for the challenges of adult life in medieval society. Religious faith provided comfort and hope for many medieval children. The promise of eternal life and divine justice helped them endure present hardships. Religious festivals and ceremonies provided bright moments in otherwise difficult lives. The medieval worldview, while harsh in many ways, also provided a sense of purpose and meaning that helped children cope with adversity. Medieval childhood was a time of extraordinary hardship, early responsibility, and constant struggle for survival. Yet it was also a time when children developed remarkable resilience, practical skills, and strong community bonds. Understanding the lives of medieval children helps us appreciate how dramatically childhood has changed over the centuries. The protections, opportunities, and extended development period that modern children enjoy are relatively recent historical developments. These medieval children, despite facing challenges we can barely imagine, grew up to build the foundations of our modern world. They developed technologies, created art, built cathedrals, and laid the groundwork for the Renaissance and eventually the modern age. Their stories remind us that childhood, in any era, is both precious and resilient. Children have always found ways to play, learn, and grow, even in the most difficult circumstances. The human capacity for adaptation and survival is perhaps nowhere more evident than in the experiences of medieval children. As we consider their lives, we're reminded of our responsibility to protect and nurture the children of today. The medieval period shows us both how far we've come in creating safe, nurturing environments for children, and how important it is to continue working to ensure that all children have the opportunity to reach their full potential. The legacy of medieval children lives on in the institutions, traditions, and cultural achievements they helped create. Their experiences shaped the development of European civilization and continue to influence our world today.